It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a few friends and I, deep in the woods, away from the noise of the city. We had done this plenty of times before: pitch a tent, build a fire, and spend the night under the stars. This time, though, the experience was different. It was something that still haunts me when I think about it. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, a small clearing in a dense forest we'd chosen for its isolation. It was perfect. No cell service, no other campers in sight, just us and the wilderness. We set up our tents, gathered wood, and got the fire going before the sun began to dip below the horizon. By the time night fell, the fire was crackling, and we were sitting around it, laughing and telling stories. The trees loomed around us, their shadows dancing in the firelight. The sounds of the forest filled the air: crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, the occasional distant howl of an animal. As the night wore on, the conversation drifted to ghost stories, as it always does when you're out in the middle of nowhere. We shared tales we had heard growing up, each one more chilling than the last. But there was something about being in those woods, surrounded by darkness, that made the stories feel a little too real. At one point, I stood up to grab more firewood from the pile we had gathered earlier. The darkness beyond the ring of firelight was absolute, swallowing up everything. My flashlight barely cut through it. As I bent down to pick up some logs, I heard a faint sound, soft, almost like a whisper, coming from the trees. I froze, straining to hear it again. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it more clearly: a low, hushed voice, barely audible, coming from deeper in the woods. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe an animal or the wind whistling through the branches. I quickly gathered the wood and hurried back to the fire. I didn't mention the sound to my friends, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. We continued talking, but I couldn't relax. Every now and then, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, into the dark woods beyond. It wasn't long before the others started noticing it too. A rustling sound, soft and distant at first, but gradually getting closer. We all fell silent, listening. The rustling seemed to move around us, circling the campsite, just beyond the firelight. Every time one of us shone a flashlight into the trees, the noise would stop, only to resume as soon as the light was turned off. By now, the fire didn't feel as warm as it had before. The comforting glow seemed smaller, weaker, as if the darkness was pressing in on us. We exchanged nervous glances, each of us trying to convince ourselves that it was just an animal: a deer, maybe, or a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. Then, we heard it: a single, clear snap of a branch breaking, followed by silence. We all jumped, our flashlights immediately pointing in the direction of the noise. But there was nothing there, just trees and darkness. The silence that followed was deafening, and the air felt thick with tension. After what felt like an eternity, one of my friends spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we should just get some sleep. We all nodded, though none of us really believed we'd be able to rest. He doused the fire, climbed into our tents, and zipped them up tight. I lay there, every muscle tense, listening for any sound outside. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if it were holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. Hours passed, or at least it felt like it. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the soft glow of dawn filtering through the trees. The forest felt different in the daylight, calmer, less menacing. We packed up quickly that morning, none of us saying much. The unease from the night before still lingered, but in the daylight, it felt like a distant memory, something we could shrug off as just our imaginations playing tricks on us. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing back at the trees, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the quiet, peaceful forest. We all made it home safely, and life went on as usual. But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I hear that faint rustling sound in my mind, and I remember that night in the woods. I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was just an animal, maybe it was nothing at all. But whatever it was, I've never been able to forget it. It was a crisp autumn weekend when a group of friends and I decided to go camping in a remote area of the national forest. We had picked a spot far from the usual campsites, wanting to escape the crowds and enjoy some solitude. Little did we know, our peaceful retreat would turn into a night of unsettling experiences. We arrived at our chosen site in the early afternoon. The sun was bright, and the forest was ablaze with fall colors. We set up our tents and gathered firewood, excited for a weekend of hiking, stories, and camaraderie. As dusk approached, we lit the campfire and settled in with marshmallows and hot dogs. As the night grew darker, we noticed an eerie silence settling over the campsite. The usual sounds of the forest rustling leaves, chirping crickets had vanished. It felt as though we were enveloped in a strange, oppressive quiet. We shrugged it off, attributing it to the time of year or just the remoteness of our location. Around midnight, as we were telling ghost stories around the fire, one of my friends, Jake, decided to take a walk to explore the area. He'd brought a flashlight and promised to be back shortly. We watched him disappear into the darkness, his flashlight bobbing through the trees. We continued our stories, laughing and trying to ignore the creeping chill. After about half an hour, Jake still hadn't returned. We began to grow concerned and called out for him, but there was no response. I decided to go look for him, flashlight in hand. The forest was unnervingly quiet as I walked in the direction Jake had taken. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing only dense trees and underbrush. I called Jake's name a few more times, but the only answer was the sound of my own voice echoing back at me. I ventured further, feeling increasingly uneasy. The quiet was unsettling, and the darkness seemed to press in on me. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing among the trees, illuminated by the light of my flashlight. It was tall, with an indistinct shape that seemed to blend into the shadows. My first thought was that it was Jake playing a prank, but something about the figure felt wrong. It didn't move, and the air around it felt heavy. I took a cautious step forward, but the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me alone in the darkness. I hurried back to the campsite, my heart pounding. When I arrived, Jake was already there, looking concerned. He had gotten lost but had managed to find his way back. We told him about the figure I had seen, and he seemed just as unnerved as I was. We decided to pack up and move closer to the main trail, thinking it would be safer. The night was far from restful, with the strange figure and the oppressive silence hanging over us. We kept a close watch on the surroundings and tried to ignore the sense of being watched. The next morning, we packed up and left the campsite as quickly as we could. The forest seemed to welcome us back with its familiar sounds, and the unsettling experience of the night before gradually faded into the background of our minds. When we returned home, we shared our experience with friends and family. Reactions ranged from curiosity to skepticism, but none of us could explain what we had seen in the woods. We later learned that the area we had camped in had a reputation for unusual occurrences, though nothing as specific as our encounter. To this day, I can't fully explain what I saw in that forest. The figure and the strange silence remain a mystery, and I'm grateful that nothing more sinister came of it. Sometimes, the forest holds secrets that are best left undiscovered, and I've learned to respect the unknown. Despite the fear and unease, we all returned safely, with a story that reminds us that the most ordinary places can hide the most extraordinary mysteries. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to go camping in a remote national park. We were experienced campers, used to roughing it out in the wilderness. This trip was supposed to be a straightforward escape from the city, but it turned into something far more unsettling. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. It was a beautiful spot by a small lake, surrounded by tall pine trees. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. We set up our tents and started a campfire, eager to enjoy a night under the stars. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional call of a distant owl. Around midnight, we decided to turn in, knowing we had a long hike planned for the next day. I was the first to wake up in the morning, as usual. I stepped out of the tent and stretched, taking in the serene morning landscape. The lake was calm, reflecting the early sunlight. I decided to take a walk around the campsite while everyone else was still asleep. I wandered along the edge of the lake, admiring the peaceful surroundings. After a while, I noticed a narrow trail leading into the woods, partly obscured by overgrown vegetation. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it for a short while. The trail was well trodden, suggesting that it was occasionally used. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the campsite faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. I walked for about 15 minutes before I noticed something unusual, a series of small, handmade signs nailed to the trees. They were crudely written in faded ink, with messages like "stay away" and "danger." My heart skipped a beat. This was supposed to be a remote area, and these signs felt out of place. I considered turning back but was intrigued by the mystery. I continued along the trail until I came across a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large, old tree with what looked like a hollowed-out trunk. I approached the tree and peered inside the hollow. It was dark, but I could make out what appeared to be old, withered objects, pieces of cloth, a few broken toys, and a small, rusted lockbox. My curiosity was piqued, but I didn't want to touch anything. The eerie feeling of being watched was growing stronger. I decided it was best to head back. As I retraced my steps, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a faint, distant voice, like someone calling out. It was too faint to make out any words, and the direction seemed unclear. I quickened my pace, the unsettling feeling growing with each step. When I reached the campsite, my friends were already up and preparing breakfast. I didn't mention the trail or the signs, not wanting to worry them. We spent the day hiking and enjoying the park, but the strange encounter lingered in my mind. That night, we sat around the campfire again, laughing and recounting the day's adventures. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every sound seemed amplified, and the darkness of the woods felt oppressive. They had dismissed it as wildlife, but it added to my unease. The next morning, we packed up and left the campsite, eager to return to civilization. The area around the lake was as beautiful as ever, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered from my earlier encounter. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest, wondering about the strange trail and the messages on the trees. To this day, I can't fully explain what I experienced in that remote part of the woods. The handmade signs, the hollowed tree, and the mysterious voices remain a chilling memory. Despite the unsettling nature of the encounter, we all returned safely. Sometimes, the wilderness holds secrets that are best left undiscovered, and I'm content with the knowledge that some mysteries are better left unexplored. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to go camping in a remote forest area known for its tranquility and beautiful landscapes. The campsite was about a mile from the nearest hiking trail, surrounded by dense trees and a small, serene lake. We were looking forward to a peaceful weekend away from the city. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon, set up our tents, and started a campfire. The evening was perfect: clear skies, a light breeze, and the soothing sounds of nature. We cooked dinner, shared stories, and enjoyed the warmth of the fire as night fell. After dinner, we sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and chatting. As the night grew darker, the forest around us became almost eerily quiet. The usual sounds of nocturnal animals seemed absent, and an unsettling silence settled in. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. We turned in, each of us retreating to our respective tents. I was in my tent, lying on my sleeping bag, when I heard a soft rustling noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal moving through the underbrush. I tried to ignore it and drift off to sleep. The rustling continued, growing louder and more persistent. I unzipped my tent and peeked outside, but I saw nothing unusual. I assumed it was just a curious animal, perhaps a raccoon or deer, and decided to try to sleep again. A short while later, I was jolted awake by a loud, thumping noise coming from the edge of the campsite. It sounded like something heavy was being dragged across the ground. My heart raced as I lay still, trying to figure out what could be causing the sound. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped my tent, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. I stepped outside, scanning the area with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and the still surface of the lake. The thumping had stopped, and the silence returned. I walked around the campsite, checking the perimeter, but there was no sign of disturbance. Feeling uneasy but unwilling to wake my friends, I returned to my tent and tried to calm down. Just as I was about to drift back to sleep, I heard the thumping noise again, this time much closer. It sounded like it was right outside my tent. I froze, listening intently. The noise was accompanied by a faint, rhythmic scraping sound, like something dragging along the ground. I slowly unzipped the tent again and peered outside, but the darkness was impenetrable. My anxiety grew, and I decided to wake my friends. I quietly unzipped my tent and called out to them. They emerged from their tents, groggy and confused. I explained the noises I had heard, and we decided to investigate together. With flashlights in hand, we carefully explored the area around the campsite. We checked the edge of the forest, the lake, and even the nearby hiking trail, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The thumping noise had ceased, and the forest was eerily quiet once again. After a thorough search, we returned to the campsite, still puzzled but feeling slightly more at ease. We decided to stay up for a while longer, chatting and keeping watch. The rest of the night passed without incident, and eventually, we all managed to get some sleep. The next morning, we packed up and left the campsite, still discussing the strange noises from the night before. We speculated about what could have caused them, perhaps a fallen tree branch being dragged by the wind or an animal moving through the underbrush. Despite the unsettling experience, nothing bad happened to us, and we all returned home safely. The mysterious noises remain unexplained, but they served as a reminder that even the most peaceful places can hold secrets and strange occurrences. Sometimes, the forest is more mysterious than we can comprehend, and it's best to respect the unknown. A few years ago, I went camping with a few friends in a remote national park known for its stunning views and tranquility. We were seasoned campers, accustomed to the usual outdoor discomforts and challenges. However, what we experienced that weekend was something that none of us had ever encountered before. We arrived at our campsite on a Friday afternoon. The area was secluded, surrounded by dense forest and a small, serene lake. We set up our tents, built a fire pit, and spent the afternoon relaxing by the water. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves, a soothing backdrop to our evening. Around midnight, after a hearty meal and several rounds of stories, we retired to our tents. The night was still, and the temperature dropped, but we were comfortably warm in our sleeping bags. I was just about to drift off when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from outside. I initially dismissed it as the wind or perhaps an animal moving through the underbrush. However, the tapping grew louder and more persistent. It wasn't the sporadic rustling of branches or the scurrying of small creatures. It was deliberate, almost as if someone or something was knocking on our tent. I nudged my friend Tom, who was sleeping in the tent with me. He stirred gradually, and we both listened intently. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a low and settling hum that seemed to resonate through the tent walls. Tom and I decided to investigate. We cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped outside, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The forest was silent except for the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. We searched around our campsite but found nothing amiss. The tapping had stopped, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. We returned to our tent, feeling a bit unsettled but trying to brush it off as nerves. We talked for a while, trying to make sense of the sounds, before eventually falling asleep. The rest of the night passed without incident, and the next morning, we discussed the previous night's events with the rest of our group. Everyone was skeptical but agreed it was probably an animal or the wind. That evening, we gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and enjoying the warmth. As darkness fell, the forest seemed more alive than before. We decided to play a game of flashlight tag, running through the trees and laughing despite the encroaching darkness. At one point, while I was hiding behind a tree, I heard the tapping again. It was coming from a distance, faint but unmistakable. I felt a chill run down my spine. I carefully made my way back to the campfire, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. Later, as we prepared for bed, the tapping resumed, this time closer and more rhythmic. My friends were starting to get nervous, and we all decided to stay up a little longer, chatting around the fire to keep our minds off the unsettling noise. As we sat there, one of our friends, Emily, suggested we check out the source of the tapping once and for all. We hesitated but eventually agreed. We followed the sound to a small clearing a few hundred yards from our campsite. The tapping grew louder as we approached, and our flashlights revealed an old, abandoned wooden shed that we had missed during the day. The shed was weathered and overgrown with vines, its door slightly ajar. We approached cautiously, and as we peered inside, the tapping ceased. There was nothing unusual inside, just old, dusty furniture and remnants of a bygone era. We decided to explore the area around the shed but found no signs of recent activity or anything that could explain the tapping. The forest was silent again, and we reluctantly made our way back to camp. That night, the tapping did not return. We were all on edge but managed to get some sleep. The next day, we packed up and left the campsite, eager to return to civilization. None of us spoke much about the tapping, but the experience left an impression on all of us. To this day, I'm not sure what caused the mysterious tapping. Was it an animal, an environmental anomaly, or something more supernatural? The experience was unsettling, but we were all fortunate to leave the woods safely and without harm. Sometimes, the unknown remains just that tan enigma that adds a layer of mystery to our outdoor adventures. A few summers ago, my friends and I decided to go camping in a remote area of the national forest. We were seasoned campers, so we felt confident setting up in a more secluded spot, away from the main trails and campgrounds. The location was picturesque, a small clearing by a serene lake, surrounded by dense forest. It felt like the perfect escape from our busy lives. The first night was everything we hoped for. We set up our tents, built a fire, and enjoyed a meal under the stars. As the night deepened, the forest around us grew still, with only the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl breaking the silence. We went to bed around midnight, feeling content and relaxed. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. At first, it was faint, almost like the sound of a branch snapping or an animal moving through the underbrush. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the sound grew louder and more rhythmic, like footsteps crunching through the forest floor. I lay still in my sleeping bag, my heart racing as I listened to the growing noise. It was unnerving, as if someone or something was walking around our campsite. I nudged my friends, but they were deep in sleep and didn't respond. Summoning my courage, I decided to investigate, hoping it was just a deer or some other forest animal. I quietly unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The moon was bright, casting a silvery light over the clearing. I scanned the area, but everything seemed peaceful and untouched. The footsteps, however, were still audible, coming from the direction of the dense forest behind our campsite. With my flashlight in hand, I carefully ventured toward the sound. The forest was dark and foreboding, the trees casting long, menacing shadows. The crunching sound continued, growing louder as I approached. I called out, "Hello," but the only response was the echo of my voice. As I reached the edge of the forest, the sound abruptly stopped. I stood there, frozen, straining to hear anything else. The forest was eerily quiet now, and I began to question whether I had imagined the entire thing. I turned to head back to camp when I noticed something unsettling, a series of fresh, muddy footprints leading from the edge of the forest toward our campsite. The footprints were large, and they looked like they were made by someone wearing heavy boots. I followed them back to the campsite, where they disappeared near our tents. My anxiety increased as I realized the footprints came alarmingly close to our sleeping area. I hurried back to the tents and woke my friends. They were groggy and confused but took me seriously when I showed them the footprints. We decided to stay up and keep watch for the rest of the night, though nothing further happened. The footsteps didn't return, and the rest of the night passed without incident. In the morning, we examined the area more closely. The footprints had vanished with the dawn, leaving only the faintest impression in the ground. We were unable to find any other signs of disturbance. We talked to other campers on the trail and found out that this part of the forest had been known for some unexplained occurrences, but no one had ever experienced anything threatening. We decided to cut our trip short, packing up and leaving the campsite by midday. Although we didn't find any concrete evidence of what had caused the sounds or the footprints, the experience left us shaken. We speculated about possible explanations, from pranksters to wildlife, but none of them fully satisfied our unease. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. The footprints and the sounds remain a mystery, a chilling reminder of how quickly the comfort of nature can turn into something unsettling. Despite the fear and uncertainty, we all returned home safely, and the experience became a story we'd share for years to come, one that left us with a healthy respect for the unknown and a renewed appreciation for the safety of well-traveled campgrounds.